The carbon scrubber in Section D had finally given up pretending to be functional around hour 14 of Hayes's shift, which meant he'd spent the last 2 hours lying on his back in a ventilation shaft that smelled like recycled mistakes, replacing filter membranes while the station AI cheerfully reminded him every 20 minutes that optimal air quality was temporarily compromised. No kidding. His toolkit had fallen twice, scattering precision instruments across the deck plating, and somewhere around the third dropped wrench. Hayes had stopped cursing and started laughing because what else could you do when you were alone in a metal tube floating around an unnamed gas giant, covered in machine oil, with a filter gasket stuck to your forehead? The repair finally held at hour 16. Hayes crawled out of the shaft, collected his scattered tools, and made his way back through corridors that all looked identical. Gray composite walls, blue guidance strips along the floor, and the occasional potted plant that the botanists insisted improved morale, despite looking half dead themselves. His reflection in a darkened observation port showed someone who desperately needed a shower and possibly a new career. The station's night cycle had started, dimming the overhead lights to a soft amber that was supposed to encourage healthy sleep patterns. Hayes passed exactly 0 people on his way to residential section, which wasn't unusual. Kepler 7 housed 17 researchers who mostly worked in their labs and ate in their quarters, communicating through reports and avoiding eye contact in hallways like proper introverts. His door recognized his biometrics with a happy little chirp that always sounded inappropriately cheerful, like it was excited to seal him into his 4 by 3 meter box for another night. The quarters were exactly as he'd left them. Bed folded down from the wall, single chair, desk, with a dead plant he kept forgetting to water, and the faint smell of recycled air that no filter could quite eliminate. Hayes stripped off his oil-stained coveralls, stepped into the shower cubicle that gave him exactly 4 minutes of water as per station conservation protocols, and scrubbed off the day's accumulated grime while mentally reviewing tomorrow's maintenance schedule. Another thrilling day of checking atmospheric processors and pretending the endless hum of life support systems wasn't slowly driving him insane. He collapsed into bed without bothering to check his message queue or review the day's reports, which would just be more variations of systems nominal, and please fix the thing in section whatever. Sleep came fast, the kind of immediate shutdown that happens after 16 hours of physical labor in confined spaces. The station continued its slow orbit, its fusion reactors humming their eternal song, its sensors tracking every molecule of air and every heartbeat of its 17 isolated inhabitants. When Hayes woke 7 hours later, his first thought was that someone had adjusted the temperature controls because he felt warmer than usual. His second thought was that the warmth had weight and was breathing. His third thought was the beginning of a very slow panic that started in his chest and worked its way toward his brain, which was still booting up and not quite ready to process whatever was happening. He opened his eyes carefully. In the dim blue glow of the environmental display, he could see dark hair that seemed to drink the light, pale skin with an iridescent shimmer, and an arm draped across his chest like it belonged there. Hayes lay very, very still and wondered if carbon dioxide poisoning caused extremely specific hallucinations. Hayes had approximately 38 minutes before his shift started, which gave him 37 minutes to figure out why there was an unauthorized person in his bed, and 1 minute to have a small private breakdown about it. He chose to skip the breakdown and focus on the unauthorized person problem, mostly because breakdowns required energy he didn't have after waking up to find his arm wrapped around someone who definitely hadn't been there when he fell asleep. She was still asleep, breathing in a rhythm that was just slightly wrong. Too measured, too perfect, like someone had programmed respiration instead of letting biology handle it. 8 seconds in, 8 seconds out, precise as a metronome. Hayes extracted himself from the bed with the careful movements of someone who'd once had to defuse a malfunctioning pressure valve and had learned that slow was survivable. His feet hit the cold deck plating, and he stood there in his underwear, staring at the sleeping figure and running through explanations that made progressively less sense. Administrative error? The station AI tracked everything. You couldn't sneeze without it logging the event as minor respiratory occurrence, non-pathogenic. Someone bypassing his biometric lock? Possible if you were a systems engineer with clearance. Hayes definitely didn't have. Impossible if you were a random person who just felt like breaking into someone's quarters for a nap. Shared hallucination caused by a station-wide contamination event? He glanced at the environmental display. All green, optimal levels, no alerts. Everything was fine, except for the glowing woman in his bed. Glowing. That was new information his brain had just processed. Her skin had a faint luminescence in the darkness, like bioluminescent plankton he'd seen in Earth oceans before signing up for deep space work. It shifted subtly between pale cream and soft lavender, responding to something, her breathing cycle, maybe, or dreams, or alien biology that Hayes's 4 months of basic xenobiology training hadn't covered. He pulled on his coveralls, moving quietly because waking her up seemed like it would require a conversation he wasn't prepared to have. Questions like, "Who are you?" and "How did you get past a biometric lock?" and "Why are you glowing?" seemed important, but also overwhelming before he'd had coffee substitute. His hand drifted toward the emergency comm panel 3 times. 3 times he stopped, looking at her peaceful face, her too slow breathing, the way she'd curled into the space he'd vacated like she was trying to stay warm. The shift chime sounded softly. 15 minutes to report. Hayes looked at the door, looked at the sleeping woman, and made a decision that would probably violate at least 9 station protocols and possibly several interstellar treaties he didn't know existed. He grabbed his toolkit, verified his biometric credentials at the door panel, and left his quarters, sealing the impossible situation inside while he went to maintain environmental systems and pretend everything was completely normal. The door locked behind him with its usual cheerful chirp. His badge registered his exit. The Station A. I logged his movement toward the maintenance sector. Everything was exactly as it should be, documented and monitored and recorded. Everything except the alien woman sleeping in his bed, who somehow existed in the gap between what the sensors could see and what was actually happening. Hayes made it to Section C before he started laughing. The kind of slightly unhinged laughter that happens when your brain finally catches up to absurd reality. A passing botanist gave him a concerned look and hurried away, probably making a mental note to mention something to medical about the maintenance tech losing it in the hallway. He had 6 hours of shift work to figure out what to do. 6 hours to decide whether to report an impossible visitor or just see what happened next. 6 hours to wonder why the most alarming part of waking up with a stranger wasn't the stranger herself, but how right it had felt to have someone there. The atmospheric processor in Section C needed recalibration. Hayes got to work and tried very hard not to think about what he'd find when his shift ended. The shift lasted 6 hours and felt like 60. Hayes recalibrated 3 atmospheric processors, replaced 2 filter assemblies, and performed routine diagnostics on the water recycling system, while his mind ran through approximately 200 scenarios for what he'd find back in his quarters. Most of them ended with security officers, incident reports, and a one-way trip back to Earth, with violated first contact protocols stamped on his permanent record. A few optimistic scenarios involved waking up and discovering the whole thing had been a stress-induced dream brought on by too much time alone in recycled air. None of his scenarios prepared him for what actually happened when he coded his biometrics at his door and stepped inside. She was awake, sitting cross-legged in the middle of his bed, looking directly at him with eyes that were almost human, except they weren't. No whites, just amber iris and pupil that seemed to generate their own soft light in the dim quarters. Her hair still absorbed the light around it, creating a strange halo effect that made his eyes hurt if he looked too long. She wore the same clothes as she'd been sleeping in, a simple gray shirt and pants that looked like station issue, except they definitely weren't, because station issue clothing didn't shimmer when you moved. They stared at each other. Hayes clutched his toolkit like it might offer protection, or at least moral support. She tilted her head slightly, the gesture so precisely curious that it felt rehearsed, then smiled in a way that was clearly meant to be reassuring, but mostly just confirmed. She wasn't entirely sure how human faces worked. "So," Hazar said, because someone had to say something and she didn't seem inclined to start. "This is happening." She nodded, still smiling that slightly wrong smile. "I should probably report you. That's definitely what I'm supposed to do. There are protocols. Many protocols. So many protocols." He was rambling, which happened when he was nervous, which was reasonable given the circumstances. "I'm technically supposed to hit that alarm." He gestured at the emergency panel. "And then security comes and asks uncomfortable questions like, 'Why is there an unauthorized alien in your quarters?' And I say something like, 'I don't know. She was just there when I woke up.' And they say that's not how biometric locks work. And then everything gets very complicated, very quickly. She watched him talk, her expression shifting through what might have been understanding or might have been polite confusion. When he finally stopped for breath, she made a small gesture, hand to her chest, then toward him, then a sort of settling motion, like smoothing a blanket. Hayes blinked. I have no idea what that means. She repeated the gesture, slower, more deliberate. Hand to chest, toward him, settling. You're staying? You want to stay? He felt ridiculous interpreting charades from a glowing alien woman in his quarters, but she nodded enthusiastically, her skin brightening slightly in what he was starting to recognize as some kind of emotional response. Okay, we'll work with that. Hayes set down his toolkit and rubbed his face, trying to jump-start his brain into something resembling functional. Are you hungry? Do you eat? Is food a thing your species does? Another nod, this one more tentative. He pulled out his meal ration from the wall dispenser, something that claimed to be protein synthesis with vegetable compounds, but mostly tasted like the concept of food rather than actual food. He split it awkwardly onto 2 plates, handed her one, and they sat there eating reconstituted nutrients in complete silence. She tried the food, made a face that transcended species barriers, and clearly meant this is terrible, but ate it anyway. Hayes almost laughed, caught himself, then laughed anyway, because the situation had moved beyond absurd into some new category that didn't have a name yet. Welcome to deep space, he said. The food is awful, the air smells recycled, and apparently our security systems are decorative. You picked a great place to mysteriously appear. She smiled again, more naturally this time, and her skin glowed warmer. Hayes decided that reporting her could wait until after he figured out what was actually happening, or possibly forever. Forever seemed like a reasonable timeline. 3 weeks passed in a routine that violated every station protocol, while somehow going completely unnoticed. Hayes went to work, repaired things, returned to quarters where she waited, and they existed together in a silence that had stopped feeling strange somewhere around day 4. She never spoke, but she communicated through gestures that became a language between them. A tilt of her head meant curiosity. Her skin brightening meant contentment. The way she'd press close when he returned from shift meant something like welcome home, which was absurd because this was a research station, not a home, except it was starting to feel like one. The station AI never flagged a second occupant. The biometric sensors never registered her presence. Hayes stopped questioning it around week 2 when he realized she existed in some gap the monitoring systems couldn't perceive, like she was operating on a frequency the station wasn't designed to measure. He showed her how the meal dispenser worked, and she made faces at every option, which was fair because they all tasted like nutritional obligations. He tried teaching her chess using a magnetic set from the recreation locker, and she won 4 games in a row before he realized she wasn't following the rules so much as inventing better ones. On day 22, Hayes finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been building since she arrived. He sat cross-legged on the bed across from her, pulled out his tablet, and spent 10 minutes sketching out symbols until he managed something approximating, "Why did you come here?" She looked at the tablet, then at him, and her skin cycled through colors he hadn't seen before, deep amber to soft gold to something that looked like sunset. She pointed to him, then pressed her hand against her chest where a heart would be, then made a gathering motion, like pulling something close and holding it safe. Hayes stared at the gesture, his brain slowly translating the meaning. Safe. She'd come because he felt safe. That's it? You just showed up in my quarters because... He trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. Because sleeping alone in a monitored station felt worse than crossing impossible boundaries? Because some quality of his presence had broadcast safety across whatever distance she'd traveled? The implications made his head hurt. She nodded, her glow settling into warm contentment, and reached out to touch his hand. Her fingers were cooler than human, but not uncomfortably so, and she held on like she was anchoring herself to something solid. The discovery happened 4 days later during a routine system audit when an administrator noticed atmospheric consumption rates that didn't match logged personnel. Hayes got summoned to the command office, which never happened unless something was very right or very wrong, and given his recent choices, probably wrong. The station commander, a tired woman named Okoye, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, pulled up Hayes's quarters data and asked him to explain the discrepancy. He could have lied, should have lied. Instead, he said, "There's someone staying with me," and watched Okoye's expression cycle through confusion, alarm, and profound exhaustion in under 3 seconds. The investigation took 2 days and concluded with more questions than answers. Yes, there was an unregistered alien in Hayes's quarters. No, she hadn't triggered any security protocols. No, she hadn't caused contamination or posed any threat. Yes, this violated approximately 17 regulations. No, nobody could figure out how she'd arrived or how to make her leave. When asked directly if she wanted to go, she'd looked at Hayes and pressed closer to him, which the xenolinguistics team interpreted as absolutely not. The final report classified her as spontaneous, peaceful contact, and added a note to Hayes's file about unconventional diplomatic initiative, which was probably the nicest way anyone had ever said, "You accidentally made first contact by being too tired to report the alien in your bed." She got retroactively cleared for station residence. Hayes got a commendation he didn't deserve, and a pay increase he absolutely did for maintaining environmental systems that apparently now included maintaining peaceful interspecies relations. 6 months later, Hayes still couldn't explain to visiting researchers why she'd chosen him specifically. They wanted data about human pheromones, or psychological profiles, or cultural factors. The truth was simpler and stranger. She'd traveled impossible distances because something about him felt like home before they'd ever met. And she'd decided that was worth more than protocols or explanations or sense. On quiet nights, when the station hummed its eternal song and she slept pressed against him in quarters designed for isolation, Hayes understood something fundamental had shifted. He'd spent months alone in recycled air, and she'd apparently spent longer alone somewhere else. And somehow, they'd found each other across the gap between loneliness and connection. The galaxy could keep its surveillance and regulations and monitored boundaries. This was better.